Welcome to this version of Conversation with Your Congressman. I'm your Congressman, John Tierney, and very pleased to have with me here today a colleague and a friend, Chris Shays, who served with me on the Government Oversight and Reform Committee for a number of years, was the chairperson of the Subcommittee on National Security and Foreign Affairs, and then the ranking member, or the ranking member first, then the chairperson on that. And just a valuable member of Congress.
And I even came up to your district. We had a hearing up there.
We had a hearing on the veterans issues up in the district. A good example of how people in Congress can and do work together for all that we read about and we hear about. Chris Shays left Congress with a reputation of being a thoughtful, hard-working, sincere member of Congress, and now he's running for the Senate in Connecticut, and we wish him well there.
Thank you.
That'll be an adventure to see how people on the other side of the hill live.
It will be an absolute adventure.
On that. But the real reason we have Chris here today is to talk about a particular issue on that, and that is the Commission on Wartime Contracting. Chris Shays was in Congress from 1987 to 2009. Before that, you served in the state legislature, and before that, you were in the Peace Corps. And I think what that's indicative of is a man that believes in public service and lends himself to it, because after he got out of Congress, we imposed upon him to take a co-chairmanship role on the Wartime Contracting Commission.
A commission that you basically helped establish.
Thank you. Well, we're proud of that, and it's a nice idea. I was talking to Kevin McDermott, who works with me in our office on that. It was an example of having an idea, looking as we got into these contingency conflicts, the Iraqs and Afghanistans of the world, and saying, you know, something's not right about oversight on here. There were a lot of problems.
And when was that? What time?
It was about 2006 or 7, or maybe even a little bit earlier than that. And thinking that, you know, we really had to look at history and what Senator Truman, then Senator Truman, had done during World War II. And he sort of bypassed the partisan nature of it. People were concerned that this was going to be a witch hunt, but there was a Democrat in the White House, and he was a Democrat. And the notion was that when you go into war, when you have these contingency operations, there's all sorts of potential for waste, fraud, and abuse. And it happens sometimes by circumstances with no intention, and it happens sometimes with a lot of intention, people taking advantage of the situation. And Harry Truman made a name for himself, doing it in a nonpartisan manner. His Senate committee did a great job. That wasn't happening because we had so much else going on in Congress on that. So we put together the bill, and we got Jim Leach, who was our Republican colleague from Iowa at the time, to co-sponsor it. And we kept trying it a couple of years in a row, and then Jim Webb and Senator McAllister over in the Senate, McCaskill, right, got involved on it. And so together we got this thing through, and then you were good enough to serve as a co-chair of it. On that, and so I thought if we could talk about the product all the way through, because
let me just say, I mean, when you're in Congress, you have to know a little about everything, and your constituents know something more than you do. I mean, even a young child may have studied about polar bears and knows more and can tell the congressman about polar bears. But it was fun, exciting, and incredibly. It was a wonderful intellectual effort as well to just be able to focus on one area, and that is, you know, how do we fund contractors, how do we oversee them, and so on. And I thank you for, pushing forward this commission, because I think we added value to the government's knowledge, and wonderful opportunity.
We absolutely added value. It was one of the good things of this. We're always reluctant to form another commission or another advisory group on that. We're going to be able to take the work that your commission did and make legislation out of it that's going to be instructive on that. So I thought what we might do today is go through some of the areas. We actually had, folks at home should know, we had a hearing earlier today on the work, the final report of the committee, who did 7 interim reports, was it? And,
we did a first interim report. We did 5 special reports. We did a second interim report, and then the final report.
Right. And we've had an opportunity on the Oversight and Reform Committee to periodically have the members of the Commission come in and give us an update, and to read the materials, and of course to read this fine report, which folks can get. They just want to contact our office. It's Transforming Wartime Contracting, Controlling Costs and Reducing Risks. We had seen a lot of bad situations in Iraq, of contractors sort of run amok and money being really wasted and lost. We didn't really learn those lessons quickly enough in Afghanistan, because we really didn't have a structure set up that you could transition and take those lessons learned. And so we started to compound them again. It's about when we got involved in the national security.
You're saying we didn't really learn them in Iraq when we were first starting out. And we had an opportunity to learn them in Afghanistan, and we still haven't learned them.
And that's it. Well, and from that, maybe we started what I thought was going to be the end, but started on that. One of the recommendations of the commission was that there ought to be an inspector general to sort of oversee all contingency operations. Whenever this country gets involved in a situation overseas, there already be in place an inspector general and an apparatus that could shrink when there really wasn't a lot going on, but expand again, and you would have an experienced cadre of people who could go in at the outset and sort of advise the Department of Defense, the Secretary of State's office, the United States aid office as they went in, as to how they ought to set up to avoid some of these things, how their contracting ought to work, how they ought to be overseen and managed, and maybe avoid a lot of it to begin with, but then also be there from the very first day to oversee and make sure that this is done and adjustments are made. So that recommendation came out of there, and I've filed a bill for it, taking advantage of your hard work, and there'll be a lot of other recommendations in here as well. So starting with that,
so let me give you some context
right.
of why we ended up with that recommendation. First off, we have more contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan than we have military. Right. Now, and it's basically understood that we can't go to war without contractors. You and I and others want the military to be the tip of the spear. We don't want them to be cleaning laundry and so on. There are some things you can have contractors do. But it's stunning to think that really half the effort now, it's a one-to-one contractor to a military. And we learned pretty quickly that we weren't prepared to go to war with contractors, even though we need contractors. And we then started out saying, well, our challenge must be that we got to manage them better. We've got to write better contracts. We've got to oversee the contracts better. We've got to, make sure they're doing what they're doing, not overpay them, make sure we're getting a competitive price. All those things we need to do. But then we began to realize, well, if we can't oversee them well, then maybe we shouldn't be using so many. And we thought, well, maybe that's kind of where the new element to our learning. And then we thought, you know what, we've seen how we're using contractors, and even if we can oversee them better, we began to realize we're just doing too much. So in the context, well, why would you want an inspector general? We spent about $205 billion for contractor activity in both Iraq and Afghanistan. What we noticed about, now getting right to your question, what we noticed about DOD and state and USAID, the inspector generals within those departments just look narrowly at their agency, even though their works can overflow to the other and funding can overflow. But we also realize that it's a little more difficult for an inspector general who works with the cabinet official or the agency head and these folks inside to be tough as they need to be sometimes. And we also realize they're not used to using contract. DOD is not used to a contingency effort. The inspector generals aren't used to it. And so we realized that what you voted for and I voted for, to establish an independent counsel, a contractor in Iraq, was paying dividends. You kind of had a little competition between the inspector general and DOD and the inspector general. And then we could ask DOD, how come you're not in theater? We got this special inspector general in theater. Why aren't you in theater? Mm-hmm. And we started to learn more and more and more. The other advantage is the inspector generals that we want can oversee and look at DOD, state, USAID, ag, whatever.
Just for folks at home, I assume everybody knows that DOD is the Department of Defense. That's a pretty acronym, and the State Department has a role to play as well in all the diplomatic work that goes on. And the United States aid, USAID, is our aid and development operation that goes on from that. But each one of them has their own inspector general. And then I think Chris makes a good point, is they're sort of in a funnel, and they have all those other complications on their time and in their ability to really take on sometimes the higher-ups on that. So I think this will be a good situation. I think we're going to get some support. And I think a few of my colleagues that had been reluctant to sign on because they didn't quite see how it wasn't a duplication, after your panel's testimony this morning, I think we persuaded some of them to come on.
Well, we appreciate you putting in this bill. I mean, this is one of our recommendations. You're really one of the first congressmen or senators to take a recommendation and actually put it into legislative language.
Right. I'm a liberal, and I'm
unabashed liberal.
Well, unabashed liberal, which I'm a conservative person.
Yeah.
But I've always, grown up in a sort of a liberal environment where you just, and that means that you believe in government,
right.
And you think it has a role, but that the role, you always have to watch out that it doesn't become too obtrusive, and so that's where I always see the oversight is. You can't be a progressive unless you're willing to do the oversight to get rid of the programs that don't work and then pare down the ones that get too large and the ones that sort of start intruding on people's lives. So I guess it makes you sort of a liberal conservative on that basis. And I think that's where we ought to be. You ought to be able to have government work when it should, but be able to keep it in, and the only way you keep it in is to oversee it. You come at it a bit more conservatively than I do on that, everything like that, but I think you share the oversight aspect of it and why it's important to have that function.
One of the things that was very clear. It's not a partisan issue.
Exactly.
It doesn't even have to become one. You reaching out to a Republican to sponsor the bill, that was important. We sometimes found that we didn't have disagreements among the commission members or between the Republicans on the commission and the Democrats. We found our disagreements tended to be more with our staff, because we hired a lot of practitioners, and they've been there, and they said, we can't do that. And we say, well, why can't you do that? And they said, well, the law doesn't allow it. And we say, well, one of our points is maybe we could change the law.
Yeah, maybe something should be there. Yeah.
So it was, I would be hard pressed to tell you who was a Republican or Democrat unless I consciously thought about it on the commission. Yeah. And that was really fun to have that kind of.
And that's really the way our committee structure ought to work. And I would say when you were the chair of our subcommittee, it did work by and large that way, and that was good on that. But one of the comments you made today testifying was that sometimes we try to do too much.
Yeah.
And I think, when we look at what's happening in Afghanistan, if you're not going to make the commitment to put all of the Department of Defense or State Department or USAID people in that should do inherently governmental functions, and you're going to fill it in with contractors, that if you don't at least have enough people in defense and state and aid to manage those contractors and to oversee them properly, maybe you're doing too much, and maybe you have to rethink the mission.
But I even stretch it out a little more. Even if you had the people oversee them, maybe we're doing too much. We realized that when you take Afghanistan, their gross domestic product, not their budget, their gross domestic product was about $2 billion. And we just dumped billions more. I almost got this sense when I've been there that both sides, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the government side, like us there, because they're both making a lot of money. We've thrown too much money at it. And a kind of an example of this, and there are a lot of them, but one would be we had a really thoughtful agricultural program. It was culturally sensitive, and the cultural part means a lot to me as a former Peace Corps volunteer, because if you don't know their culture, you're going to just do dumb things. And it was culturally sensitive. They were learning, and then we dumped a $350 million ag, and we just overwhelmed them. We buried this thoughtful program. We tried to spend it before the end of the fiscal year so it wouldn't get taken back. I mean, the agencies, and we wasted it big time. We wrecked a good program that was small and thoughtful and culturally sensitive.
With the best of intentions, trying to do too much at one time.
Yeah, the best of intentions, but really very destructive.
Yeah, the whole notion of what's inherently governmental or whatever is interesting, because you mentioned earlier there are some things that don't have to be done by the military. The military doesn't have to do KP on aspects of that. But then I remember one of the interesting things was the security contractors in Iraq. And General Petraeus coming in and testifying and say that is, in his mind, inherently governmental. And he gave the example of the contractors were told to take a set of materials, whatever, and bring them from this main base to an outpost. And we need it there by Thursday. Well, they'd get in there, they'd get on their truck, they'd point their guns, and they'd start blasting through town. And anybody who got in their way, they'd get out of their way one way or the other. They weren't nice to people, they weren't civil, they weren't diplomatic, and sometimes they were overpowering, and sometimes they had incidents, people getting hurt or killed. And he said they got the item there and they fulfilled their contract. He said, but when the Marines did it, they got in their vehicle and they filled it up or anything like that, and they went through it maybe a little slower. They did it a lot more diplomatically. They tried to make sure they didn't hurt or kill anybody, and they went through, and they got it there. It was a whole different result. They hadn't created anybody else that hated the United States. They didn't create anybody else that wanted to pick up the arms for the other side. And he said, and that's what Marines are trained to do.
Yeah. this is a fascinating issue for us, because we came out with our second interim report in February, and that was designed to provide legislative proposals, and 4 or 5 months before our final report. We punted on inherently governmental because it really appeared to be difficult, particularly as it related to the whole issue of security. So we kind of punted, just kicked the can down the road a bit, and forced ourselves to deal with it, and said in our interim report we would deal with it, to force ourselves to deal with it. And we came to the conclusion about these two issues, the security and inherently governmental, that if it's inherently governmental, the law says, government needs to be doing it, then the government needs to be doing it. If it's not inherently governmental, it does not mean that government shouldn't do it. And then we said, you need to introduce this whole issue of risk, and that got into the whole thing of security. Because legally, you can use contractors. In certain instances, legally, they aren't necessarily termed inherently government. But the risk is so great, as you point out.
Should they? Should they be used?
And the answer is no. Yeah. Now, State did something that I thought was insightful and resolved one of the problems they had. They had problems with their security folk, and they put a DS agent, a Department of State agent, in charge of the convoy that would be taking, you or me or someone else from one part of Baghdad to another. And the incidences just dropped by having that command be directly under state. Which is basically, you put someone in charge and hold them accountable, they're going to make sure, unless they want to lose their job.
Well, the accountability aspect, good segue. Yeah. Was another piece of it, though. We really learned that sometimes the nature of the way the contract was written worked against our interest. I think I shared with you the contract for the trucking.
Yeah, I wanted to get into that. I just got to say this to you. You told us you were going to get into this. We were thinking we might, and we thought, nope, you're doing such a good job. We just said, go on, and we didn't want to duplicate your effort.
Well, no, that's good.
And it's fabulous fabulous. It's disturbing what you learned. Pretty amazing what you learned, and
Yeah, but I mean, we were trying to get to it. We wanted your work to be add-on to ours, and we wanted to do our job. But the important thing is, the committee has restrictions on the number of staff and time elements and things of that nature. So we really probably ought to have.
Yeah, but what you learned basically is that we were paying off the enemy to come through.
Exactly.
And
which gets back to the point, because I made earlier. If it gets to the situation where you're drawing contracts where you give a contract to 8 companies to deliver goods from one point to another, none of those companies own a truck or have any security personnel, but they're responsible for transport and security. And your contract doesn't allow you to look at the subcontractor's work or terms, then you're set up for trouble from the written document on. Then if you don't go out and have somebody riding along on those convoys, or at least stopping them periodically to check and make sure that the count is there and the right people and they're doing it the right way, and you don't have anybody supervising it, then you end up with people making payments to warlords and Taliban for protection, and that money being used against your own men and women.
I'm forgetting the page in the book, but in the book we have a bill from one of the Taliban leaders basically saying, you need to pay us a certain amount, and if you don't blame us for what will happen.
Yeah, exactly.
It was literally a bill from the Taliban.
Right out there. And so then the question comes, if that's how we're operating it, we had a hearing on that a couple of weeks ago. One of the generals there said, well, it's necessary to do that. We just cannot be putting enough forces to do it, and the Afghan army isn't equipped to do it. And then one of the other witnesses said, and it's illegal to do it. So you get the notion of, if you have to necessarily do something that's illegal, maybe you better rethink the way that you're there, or if you're there at all, and whether this is the commitment you want to make, and if what you're doing there should be done the way you're doing it.
And what was this, the transportation of water?
Well, it was water. It was almost all supplies except oil, and we did a separate hearing on oil, which had its own set of problems
big time.
on that. Well, people were taking money from Russia and not telling where it was coming from and changing the price.
But I made a point earlier that both sides like us there, and
it's the economy. The economy in Afghanistan is war.
Yeah,
that's the business.
Yeah.
And they're all making money off of us, so they like the insecurity that's going on right now, and that keeps us there, and it keeps the money there.
So if we were doing a little less, we wouldn't need as many convoys. we could then pay more attention to the convoys that came through.
And there might be more people working in Afghanistan than real estate being bought in Dubai.
And we wouldn't, exactly, and we wouldn't be basically paying off the enemy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important to have the work done that you did in the oversight, and the contracts had to be competed. You found in your work that a lot of times there were sole source contractors going that weren't competed. The prices were outrageous.
Well, we had this system, and we have a system that when the military goes to war, we gave what they call a log cap contract, and this meant that the government had a number of people compete, and one company got this contract. Well, it got a contract that they thought they would maybe make, $200 million in the course of 10 years or whatever period of time. Well, they ended up making $35 billion. And once you've been there 2 years, we should have known that we could now go into a contract where you didn't have a sole source, this one company that got this contract to do all the work.
That we should have learned from Iraq, because our Inspector General in Iraq did an excellent job eventually on tracking that type of thing down, and we didn't translate it into Afghanistan.
Well, but even in Iraq, we kept the same log
People
cap,
all the way along.
the same contractor. The military gets comfortable with one contractor. They do business with them. But the problem is that we pay a lot more than we have to.
Right. And if nobody's watching the money, then it just seems to follow the easy path. The other part that we talked about was accountability. The fact that when people are abusing a situation or acting illegally, you really have to hold them accountable. We have a whole process called debarment. So if you have a contractor who's doing something wrong, you can prohibit them from doing any other work, and that really hasn't been working.
This is the one area where we backtracked a little bit. We said in our January report, February came out, that if someone was under suspicion and they were being prosecuted, they should be debarred. And we had arguments come back to us that they aren't necessarily guilty. And the government, the administration, frankly, asked us to back off that one. And we thought, you know what, we'll back off, but we still think you're not having enough debarments. So maybe it shouldn't be automatic, but you should be using it more often.
Well, it should be. In the example of the trucking contest, where we have Wartime Risk Management was one of the companies,
right.
And Rahatullah was one of the warlords. And our investigation showed pretty clearly that they were really abusing the situation.
Just stopped doing work with them.
The Department of Defense said, we're going to debar them for sure, and then they didn't.
Well, not only should they be debarred, but then we should be able to come in with our own people. We should have one of our recommendations, a cadre of our own people who can do the work that the contractors were doing, just so the contractors don't think they can hold us hostage. But, before this program ends, the bottom line to this is we estimated that between $30 and $61 billion was wasted. Right. And we think it's close to the $61 billion. So we're talking about significant dollars, money that should never have been wasted.
But the point was also made that this needs to be worked on now, because there's ongoing expenditures of significant amounts of money, so that we need to keep up the oversight, and we need to keep getting these examples and ratchet it back. The trucking contract, of course, forced the Department of Defense to put in a set of new rules, and we're still working with them, hopefully, to refine those.
That needs to happen.
But it needs to happen. They need to do things now to stop this ongoing waste and fraud, because there's significant amounts of money to continue to be spent.
And then review what we call the non-sustainability. The projects that we know and the activities in Iraq and Afghanistan that won't continue, particularly in Afghanistan, when we leave. And they'll just be wasted. So we estimated waste and fraud between 31 and 60 billion. But then we think that the non-sustainability, good projects that can't be sustained, may come close to that 30 billion number. So we need Congress to come back and look at these, say, maybe we should reduce this project, maybe we should eliminate this project, because in the end, it's not sustainable.
Give us an example. I know there's at least one dam over there that the Global Post, Charlie Senner's group, has been writing on, and they're about an unsustainable project. You go in and you build this, but then the host country can't afford to maintain it, can't afford to get to pay the people to do it.
There's so many examples.
Don't have
there are 40 examples of waste and fraud and non-sustainable issues. But first off, you build a power plant that costs $300 million. They don't have the fuel to run the plant. They now only use it for peak period times, because it's cheaper to get electricity from from up north. So wouldn't it have been good when people were starting to debate this? Maybe if they spent $100 million, better to spend $100 million and stop it than spend $300. They don't have the technicians to run it. They don't have the skill to maintain it. They don't have the fuel to operate it. We built schools that simply there's no need to have them. I mean, it'd be nice, but
there's no teacher. There's no population.
They
for
can't
it.
sustain it. Even the training of the Iraqi police and military. When we leave, they're not going to be able to handle the number. They'll afford it.
Yeah.
Even if we say, okay, we have to ask ourselves, well, how much of that are we willing to pay? If we're willing to pay 2/3 of that force, that's the force we should have, and not train all these people that ultimately are going to be out of a job.
Yeah. So what positives did you leave with? I mean, you can get caught up in the idea of like how bad this all is, and it was some really bad things going on. But what's the positive out of that?
The positive is
the way forward.
The people in the administration are trying to deal with this issue as best they can. They are providing better oversight. There is improvement. Every day there's improvement. It's not as fast as it needs to be, but you asked me what's positive. There is improvement. You have people who are very bright who are trying to deal with this issue. And so we see progress. That's one bright spot.
Well, I'll tell you another. The other was the report itself and the hard work that all of you put into it, because it's a roadmap for changes that we can take legislatively to put in place structures that will make sure this doesn't happen again, or certainly doesn't happen to this degree. And there's a roadmap in there for each of the three departments, the Department of Defense, State, and USAID, of what they can do short of legislation to get better at this and to move now to put things into place. Without your work, I think we would have lost a lot more than we did, and we wouldn't be prepared to stop the losses that otherwise would go forward. So I want to end the same way I started. This country works because citizens decide it'll work. And we've got a lot of people right now who don't like government, and they're banging away at it. I think they ought to look at people like yourself and your other commissioners who are the ones that make government work because you believe in it. You don't want to be excessive, but you want to make it work, and you're willing to make the compromises and work with people without demonizing them. So I thank you for your service.
Thank you very much.
And I wish you luck.
Thanks.
All right, thanks.